My grandmother was a delightful old soul, but she really would throw an awful strop if I ever bruised the tea while preparing her a hot, fresh, tasty beverage. Now, of course, bruising was really just a metaphor for my act of squeezing and bashing the tea bag in the cup so that I could get to the right color as quickly as possible, finish my task, and let my little ADHD brain get back to melting candles onto anthills. Unfortunately for me, I didn't know that in my haste, I was in fact extracting a higher level of really quite harsh, bitter tannins into that cup of tea, which then overpowered the more delicate fruit and floral aromas that would have otherwise made it a fairly enjoyable drink. We've made a video previously comparing extracting tannins in tea to extracting tannins in wine, and I will leave a link to that at the end of this video. But it seems that the similarities between making tea and making wine go far beyond just tannins. They extend to oxygen as well. When you're making tea, oxygen plays the role of not only rendering polyphenols and some positive tannins in tea to becoming more water soluble, but it also facilitates the extraction of those delightful fruity and floral aromas that we talked about previously. Those delicate volatile aromas can actually be completely destroyed by the advancing army of oxygen molecules, and the end result is a really rather dull cup of tea. But on the other end of the oxygen spectrum, where there is not enough oxygen, the similarities between tea and wine depart. Because if you make tea in space, for example, you simply would have a lack of those delightful fruit and floral aromas and some tannins, and what you'd get is a boring cup of tea. But in the wine field, when making wine with not enough oxygen, the results can be diabolical. In fact, wines made in this oxygen-lacking condition have often attracted flavor notes such as fermented cabbage boiled in fox piss, rotten eggs garnished with guano, even fresh diarrhea infused with geriatric morning breath. Now, of course, what's going on in this process that's triggering all these awful aromas is that the yeast goes under stress and starts triggering through a whole bunch of processes sulfur-based compounds which really smell awful. And this is the wine fault of reduction. To understand all this, ironically, geriatric morning breath is perhaps the best way to go about it. Understanding what makes stinky reductive wines is very much like understanding what causes gingivitis. Because when it comes to preventing gingivitis, you need two things. You need vitamin C, which makes your gums healthy and gives them a good immune system so that they can handle any minor bacterial infections. And you also need good oral hygiene habits so that you can at least keep some of those bacterial things under control. Now, when it comes to winemaking, okay, you need a billion things, but for the sake of today's conversation, you also need two things to prevent sulfury, stinky wine. The first is plenty of oxygen. In this analogy, oxygen is like vitamin C because when yeast has oxygen at the beginning of fermentation, it enables it to get strong and healthy and robust, and it's like having a good immune system for the yeast, so that should it run into any troubles, it can laugh them off and carry on without causing too much stinky fuss. To continue the analogy, good oral hygiene, in the case of winemaking, is the presence of nitrogen. Now, throughout the entire fermentation process, yeast needs nitrogen to kind of do its thing. It's one of the nutrients that yeast needs. And so if nitrogen drops down, yeast stress out, and then they cause stinky sulfur compounds. But if you've got strong, healthy, happy yeast that have a good immune system, they can handle a few fluctuations in nitrogen. However, if they didn't get oxygen at the beginning of the winemaking process, then they're already kind of on edge and nervous and anxious. And then when nitrogen drops, they flip out and spaz quicker than a bubble boy in Wuhan and trigger all sorts of stinky clouds of sulfur-based gas. But it gets more complicated because you might say, well, listen, if fermentation is so stressful for yeast, why do they even bother? Well, for the most part, grapes are quite amenable to yeast. They don't mind being fermented, and it's not really a big problem, and there's usually enough nitrogen going on. But there are certain cultivars that are the nastiest nitrogen naysayers of them all, that deprive yeast of available nitrogen. In fact, they're kind of like antisocial roommates who hide your toothbrush just for the fun of it, or pour out your mouthwash in order to poison a goldfish. Now, the reason that this is all relevant is because there are two particular nasty little antisocial cultivars who make it super difficult for yeast to get access to nitrogen. And these two cultivars are Grenache and Syrah. Petit Verdot is also pretty bad, but we're focusing on Grenache and Syrah today because today's hand drink solo wine of the day is the Noble Hill Atlas Field Red Blend, which includes, yea verily, both Grenache and Syrah. Of course, it also includes a little bit of Mourvèdre and some Viognier, but we'll talk about those later. Incidentally, if you're enjoying this video and geeky conversations about nitrogen and yeast and gingivitis, then make sure that you subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel because we have more than 400 videos just like this one. And give us a like because it really does help more people to find our content. There are two interesting things that you should know about this wine. First of all, it is made with 100% organic certified fruit. Unfortunately, around the world, organic wine has kind of developed a reputation for very high prices and very low consumer satisfaction. But luckily for us, the Noble Hill Field Atlas Blend is one such wine that has comprehensively departed from that trend. The second thing to note about this particular wine is that the Syrah, Viognier, Mourvèdre and Grenache were all co-fermented. Now this really is rather unusual in South Africa, and I'll tell you why in a second. Co-fermentation of Syrah and Viognier in particular began in France in the Rhone Valley purely out of pragmatism, really. All sorts of grapes would grow together, notably Syrah and Viognier, and they would therefore be harvested together and end up in the same fermentation vat. Now, at the time, the French knew nothing about the absolutely wild, counterintuitive, magical alchemy that goes on between Syrah and Viognier. They just did it because it was easy. And in fact, it was only much later when the Californians got involved and started taking a slightly more scientific approach to winemaking that they began to realize why these two cultivars work so well when they're fermented in the same vat. Now, I've made a video about that and I go deep into the chemistry, so I'll be sure to leave a link to that at the end of this one. Now, in South Africa, many of our winemakers are inspired by the ancient winemakers of old in France, and so really, co-fermentation is something that totally fascinates them. But because of our very warm climate, it makes it quite hard to do. First of all, because in a warm climate, the gap between Syrah ripening and Viognier ripening is far more marked than it would be in a much cooler climate where everything happens more slowly. So if you were to want to ferment Viognier or Syrah in South Africa, you'd either have to have vineyards in some of the coolest climates in South Africa, or you would have to harvest Syrah really unripe and green and stalky so that the Viognier is at optimal ripeness, or you'd wait for the Syrah to get to optimal ripeness and then have Viognier being almost rotten, raisiny grapes on the vine. Or you'd have to harvest the Viognier early and then store it in some mass cooling system, which is really not very economically viable. So it makes it very tricky to do in South Africa. The winemakers who do get it right in South Africa, and there's only about a handful of them, do an absolutely sterling job because of some very smart viticulture and attention to detail. And luckily for us, again, winemaker Christopher Tillery is exactly such a winemaker, and today's Field Atlas Blend is exactly such a wine. The fruit for this wine comes from the Simonsberg, but it's not on the Stellenbosch side, which is a fairly classic winemaking region, especially for Cabernet Sauvignon. Rather, it's over on the north-facing side in Paarl. So if you take an aerial view, you'll see on the Stellenbosch side, there are classic estates like Kanonkorp and Warwick and Murati. And then over on the other side, you'll see some fairly well-established Paarl estates like Glencarlu, Noble Hill, and then Babylon Sturen. If you're that way inclined, a really fun little terroir tasting is to pick a few Cabernet Sauvignons from the Stellenbosch side of the mountain and then pick a few Cabernet Sauvignons from the Paarl side of the mountain and taste those alongside one another in a blind tasting. Noble Hill Estate was bought by the Tillery family in 2006. It was already an operational wine farm at the time, and in fact, the oldest blocks of vines on the farm are a Chenin Blanc block planted in 1987. But Christopher Tillery, for his part, is immensely inspired by the Rhone Valley. And so since then, he's planted a number of different cultivars, including Syrah, Mourvèdre, Grenache, and Viognier. But rather than talk about his planting habits, let's get into the glass and see what wine he's prepared for us. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, we do get a really lovely, vibrant vanguard of juicy blackberry, but also a little hint of pepper. And this is mostly because this wine is 81% Shiraz, which is known for flavor notes of blackberries and pepper. But you'll notice that I said it was vibrant, fresh blackberries. And that really, when it comes to Syrah, is quite an achievement. Because remember, I said that Syrah and Grenache were some of the nastiest nitrogen naysayer cultivars that really make it difficult for yeast and rob them of nitrogen, which means a winemaker has to give the yeast plenty of oxygen to make it strong and robust. So if you let oxygen into the tank, it makes the yeast strong but can decimate those delicate fruit and floral aromas. And if you keep the oxygen out, then you'll get fresh fruit, but you'll also get geriatric morning breath. So to get a Syrah that is bursting with fresh fruit but without reductive aromas, you've really walked quite a delicate tightrope as a winemaker. But the aromas are not all just blackberries and pepper. There's some sweeter kind of black plum and maybe black currant fruit pastel elements in there. And that could come from the Shiraz, but it could also come from the 11% Mourvèdre. Now, when we give this guy a sip, well, what we can say up front is it's certainly not a massive, big, bolshy 15% icon-style Shiraz. This wine is really beautifully delicate, light-stepping, and poised. A fascinating element to the wine for me is this beautiful, savory, saline seam that runs down the center of the wine. In cool climate Shiraz in South Africa, or cool climate Syrah from places like Elim, or perhaps Walker Bay, or even Bot River, you get a hint of that savory olive tapenade type element or sea spray, but Paarl is definitely neither coastal nor cool, so to get this element on this wine is a delightful surprise. Another element that's really interesting on the palate is that while the nose had some black fruit to it, the palate is really rather vibrant and coated with kind of red cherry, raspberry, brighter red fruit elements. We spoke about earlier how all 4 cultivars in this wine were all harvested on the same day, and how this can be tricky because they don't ripen at the same rate. So speaking to winemaker Christopher Tillery, what he tells me is that the Syrah is indeed harvested a little earlier than usual, but the Viognier is also quite a bit riper than most people would expect. And the end result, as you can see, works beautifully. So you have 81% of really early harvest Shiraz and Mourvèdre, and then you have that roughly 10% of really ripe Viognier, and together they dovetail into an extraordinary expression of the genre. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but as I said, I will leave a link to 2 videos. One of them talks about the marvelous chemical magic that happens between Syrah and Viognier when they are fermented together, and the other one will tell you what you can learn about winemaking while making tea for your grandmother.